What's up, YouTube, and welcome back to another episode of Homebrew Subaru. In this episode, I plan on running the RB in the S13. I'm not very far away. Realistically, I've got some wiring and the battery, fuel pump, fluids. I should be able to crank this thing over and get it to run. Whether that happens tonight or tomorrow morning, I'm not quite sure yet. I'm not even 100% sure I'm going to get this thing to fire up, but if I stick to it, I should be able to get things done. Realistically, I just need to be able to get this thing to run so I can back it out, pull it back in later. The wagon, I need to get lots of parts off of it, but even before that, the Impreza RS that I bought, it needs to come in and start getting a couple little accessories installed onto it. It's been an awesome daily driver. It is leaking coolant. I can definitely smell coolant burning off. I've had to top it up twice so far since I've been driving it. So the head gasket is seeping a little bit of coolant. I don't see it on the ground, so it's a slow enough leak that it's leaking out onto the exhaust or something and burning off from there, because I can smell it making great heat inside, and it hasn't caused any problems yet. So just keep a watch on the coolant, and as we get closer to the spring, I'll be able to plan on swapping the engine in it. Enough of that. So for today, I really need to get some wiring done, get the battery out. I'll probably take it out of the wagon and put it in this thing temporarily, and the fuel pump. And as long as I get to that point, I'll be ready to put some fluids in and turn the key. And also, before starting this episode, I had my tripod sitting on top of my tool cart, and I grabbed at something, and of course the camera went over and broke the whole top off the tripod. So I don't know if it's something I can fix later, but really my audio's got to stay on that one, and then the camera I've got on my old rig, so the audio might sound a little bit screwed up at some points, not normal. But as you can see, I've got the car kind of pulled away from the wall a little bit. The car rolls relatively easy, but as soon as you get steering, and because of the welded rear diff, you get to that point where the tire wants to break loose, and man, it becomes a good shove to get it to roll. So I think I have enough room to get that door open and at least kind of kneel down with some pads on the floor so I can kneel on, and I should be able to get in and at least start temporarily putting the wiring to the ECU so that it's powered up and ready to go. So I have the ECU harness laid out on the passenger floor. It's going to need power and ground, obviously, and it's supposed to be switched by ignition power, but temporarily, just to get this thing to run, I think I'm going to run some power, fused power from the battery up to this harness or the relays that I'll be controlling, so that I can just activate it with a wire for now. I'm not potentially going to use the key to actually crank the car over. I do have a switch panel that has a push start in it. It might be a little bit to kind of retrofit it to the actual dash, like just underneath the head unit. I will have basically the ECU power and fuel pump and stuff wired up to those switches so that I can control stuff individually. But that's going to take a little bit more wiring to do, obviously. Plus, this harness is too long. It's at least a foot too long. So it's going to need to be shortened, or I'm going to want to shorten it anyway so I can get this thing tucked up into the dash nicely. I'm going to try and go through the relays. I need the ignition power relay and the ECCS relay to basically power up the ECU harness and the sensors out underneath the hood, get the battery in. So I'm going to start there, run a power from the battery. I have to make up my breaker and stuff for the battery, so I've got to do that too. Probably I'll come back and I'll show you where I'm at. So I've spent quite a few hours getting into this. It's getting late. A change of plans. So I've decided I'm just going to kind of do a quick temporary wire for the fuel pump, kind of jump it directly to the battery. I have the battery not installed, like the box is loose, but at least the battery's sitting in there. The terminals are all tightened up. The breaker is installed and wired. This fused circuit is basically going up to the front for my ECU. So I'll show you up there. But this is just the wire for the fuel pump, So I've already kind of primed the fuel pump. I had a small leak. I've tightened one clamp. I'll just show you the passenger floor. So obviously it's still a mess down here, but I have all the circuits pretty much hooked up, soldered, so at least I can run this thing. It did take me quite a while to figure it all out again, but I'm pretty sure that I've got everything wired the way that it's supposed to. These two tiny little circuits coming down through are for the O2 sensor and mass airflow sensor. Basically the relays are triggered from this orange wire coming from the ECU, and one goes to, it splits and it triggers the ECCS relay and the ignition relay to both turn on. Only one side of the ignition relay is activated by the ECU. The other side would be from the key, so when we turn it into accessory, this relay would power up. To temporarily do that, I've just kind of routed both wires up on the brake handle, and when I touch them and kind of wind them together, that relay should get powered up. So because the lower harness out on the engine is still connected to the vehicle, I will have to crank it with the key. It should work, and then before I go to do that, turning on to accessory power, the vehicle harness would be powered. So at that point, I'll want to power up my ECU, and when I go to crank, the ECU should pick up crank signal and start firing. So the only other thing I can think of is I had this one circuit hooked up here, which was kind of to tell the ECU that it's cranking, or you're trying to attempt start. I'm not sure if I'm going to need it, so I do have a piece of wire just hanging on there if it doesn't crank over the first time. So I'm pretty sure to run it, all I've got to do is hook up temporary power to the fuel pump, connect to two wires that are up on the brake handle, and turn the key. Aside from that, I do have to put fluids in it. It has oil in it before when I first ran the engine hanging from the engine crane. So I mean, the oil's old, but I'm going to use it just to run the engine for now. I've got about a gallon of coolant, obviously probably not enough, but I'm not going to run it for very long. I've got to put some power steering fluid in, and the transmission also is empty, but I'm not going to be driving it or running it for very long either. So remember, this is all just temporary. I'm kind of dying at this point to crank this thing over and hear it run, so I think we're at that point. First start attempt is a fail. So the first start attempt was a fail. I kind of stood around scratching my head for a little while, double checked a couple little things, ended up giving the car the finger and going inside for the night. Last night I just started thinking, like, going through the wiring in my head. I walked out, kind of looked at my stuff. I almost double, triple checked my wiring. It looks to be good. So I started to think, well, why is this happening? I put a Noid light in the fuel injector harness and had no Noid pulse. So that really started to make me wonder what was going on. Is the ECU not being powered up properly, so everything comes from one sensor. Basically, it's a cam angle sensor. There is no crank sensor on these cars. So really, these do fail. They are known to fail, but not something that I want to just kind of buy and replace to try. So I just started thinking, well, what if the chain hit this harness, or maybe I actually had the harness on, and I grabbed the connector and I actually got it to click. So it's possible it wasn't fully seated, and I think that I'm just going to go ahead and try and start this thing again, because from everything else that I've looked at, everything looks good. So if it's not that, I don't know, I might have to shoot this thing. Okay, so the second startup attempt was a fail, which is really funny because if you look at my older videos, I actually ran this thing on the engine crane. So I'm just going through some more testing. I'm going to test the fuel injector circuits. I have a noid light installed here, so I'm gonna ground out the one side and make sure that lamp lights up, and then I'll probably go along the other circuits just so I can hear the other fuel injectors clicking. So it's pretty safe to say that the circuits are good. Really, my next step is actually to take off what I called the cam angle sensor earlier because it's on the camshaft, but it's actually the crank angle sensor. I should be able to remove it and give it a spin and hear the fuel injectors firing. Because wiring is the way it is, you've got to keep checking to 100% confirm this issue. This is completely unexpected. I mean, I thought I was just going to turn that key and this thing was going to fire up right away and I'd have to run to go open up the garage door. But so yeah, next step is to take off the crank angle sensor and give it a spin with all the ECU powered up and just hear if I hear some clicking. Okay, let's see what happens here. Absolutely nothing. So I've quickly done some diagnosis. Unfortunately, the diagram really kind of sucks in this area because as you can see, the connector top pin looking from the backside is 1, 2, 3, 4, but on the diagram it's 3, 1, 2, 4, and that's kind of a no-no. Diagrams have since changed from doing stuff like that. What they tried to do is make the diagram easier to read, but what they've really done is screwed up the orientation of the connector on the diagram, which is likely for people to misdiagnose it. So we've got a 4-pin connector. Basically, 2 wires are for reference, 1 degree and 120 degrees. They should be showing 5 volts from the ECU. Then we need a 12-volt supply and a ground. So the first wire on the right-hand side should be ground. And I'll put the multimeter onto my power source and probe ground. We've got a good 13-volt ground. I do have the battery charging. We'll put our test lead onto ground and test the second connection, which should be 12 volts. And it appears that we have no 12 volts, but we'll go to the next one. Our 1 degree, getting 5 volts, and the last pin on the left, 5 volts as well. So those should indicate good connections back to the ECU. It appears that I don't have a 12-volt supply to the crank angle sensor. Okay, so what I'm really looking for here is the second wire in. It looks to be like a black with white stripe, a little bit thicker gauge. So I had a really good look on the inside of the floor, you know, just kind of spreading out the harness because I can't believe I've actually lost a wire. But believe it or not, I found a black with white stripe wire sitting there waiting to be attached to something. And I think I know where I had it, and it's just it was on a little splice and it kind of jumped off. So in order to check the wire, make sure it's the right one, I've got my multimeter set up. It's connected to the wire on the other end. I'm set up on continuity check, and I will take this lead and check the second terminal for continuity. And The sound should be picking that up, but the meter's beeping. I've got the correct wire. So by giving that wire power after the ECCS relay, reinstalling the crank angle sensor, this thing had better start. So I just really wanted to show you guys the confirmation of the repair before reinstalling this thing. So I did get power fed to the wire down by the ECU. I've got the crank angle sensor reinstalled. My Noid light is still installed. And you can see we're ready to crank. So I finally got the thing to run. It started, it ran. The idle was too high, obviously, but at least now I have a driving car. I can pull it in and out. It ran very smoothly. It was hard starting, but I think that's probably because I was activating the injectors and I probably flooded it a little bit when I was testing. But just walking the throttle a little bit, I could tell that it was a little bit flooded, so I started walking the throttle and eventually it started chugging and then it just lit right up. It sounds awesome. The exhaust sounds awesome. I'm very pleased with everything so far. Absolutely no leaks anywhere. I got the power steering topped up. I didn't actually test to see if the power steering worked, but all that stuff can happen over the next couple days while I try and get this thing pulled out. It's snowed quite a bit here. Things are icing over. It's getting really cold. I got a pile of snow at the end of my driveway that's completely iced up. Fortunately, the Subies can drive through it and over it, but this thing is not going to, so I might have to wait a little while before I can actually bring the red car in and start doing some things to it. But that's pretty much what's coming next, because now that this guy can run, it can at least go outside. I've got a car cover for it. I'll try and rig up one of the hoods to sit on top, and it can just sit until I'm ready to come back to it. I'm really satisfied with the way that things turned out, and it's going to be a lot of fun this summer. So if you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up, and if you're new here and you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button for me. Leave your questions and comments further down below, and I'll see you in the next one.